A very good morning, friends and colleagues. Maybe we should get started. We're already 15 minutes overdue. So if you could take your seats. Okay, greetings and welcome everyone to the third and final day of the first Glasgow Dialogue. As we reconvene in plenary after a day dedicated to lively background discussions, we have the opportunity to hear back from the facilitators of the four groups, two of which are seated on the podium today. My co-facilitator, Christina, and I each facilitated a breakout group, and we're very happy to witness engaging discussions that covered a wide range of experiences and ideas regarding funding arrangements for activities related to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. The short report backs, which you will soon hear, will not do justice to the 4 sets of 3 hours of rich and intensive discussions. But we hope they will give us a sense of the spectrum of views exchanged around the 4 guiding questions in each of the different groups that we had in front of us. Just to remind everyone, all breakout groups were webcasted and recorded, so the exchanges will be available for all to see at your leisure. After we hear from the facilitators of the 4 breakout groups, we will open for any complementary views and interventions from the floor, points that were missing, that weren't captured, that you feel particularly strong about. But we ask you to keep those interventions brief, just to complement the insights shared by the 4 co-facilitators. We will pause after this first part of report back from the breakout groups to have a shift, just to allow you, for those who wish to have a bio break, to do so. But we will reconvene 5 minutes later to take up the more important second part of the discussion, which is about the next steps. So this is the order of the day for this session and the last session for the Glasgow Dialogue here in Bonn. And if you permit, I will ask the first co-facilitator, Christina Chan, to share with us her report back from discussions in breakout 1. Christina, please.
Thank you so much, Joe. So I'll attempt to give a report of the very rich 3 hours that we had within breakout group 1. The first point to bring back is there are existing financial arrangements and institutions that finance loss and damage, including addressing loss and damage. Those include the operating entities of the financial mechanism, risk transfer mechanisms, early warning providers, international financial institutions, MDBs, and other development cooperation more broadly, as well as national bodies and humanitarian agencies and funding channels and mechanisms. The second that I wanted to share is in Group 1, there was a debate about humanitarian assistance. On the one hand, concern was expressed that some may be equating humanitarian assistance with loss and damage, perhaps as the full answer to the challenge. Others recognize that humanitarian assistance is part of the response, but not the entire response, while others said that humanitarian assistance had nothing to do with the loss and damage response. A representative from the humanitarian community in Breakout Group 1 noted that there were lessons to draw from the humanitarian assistance architecture that are relevant to this dialogue, lessons on how to move funding quickly, ensure accessibility of finance to local actors and vulnerable populations, and anticipatory action like forecast-based finance. Third, detail was provided by some about how existing funding arrangements, while funding some types of loss and damage are inadequate and under-resourced. They gave examples of what existing financial arrangements do, of what those arrangements do not currently fund, including those related to measures to address slow onset events, and a country-specific example was given. They also gave specific proposals for how to enable the existing operating entities of the financial mechanism, particularly the GCF, to support efforts to address loss and damage. An argument was made for both strengthening existing financial arrangements and institutions to enable them to fund loss and damage and creating a new loss and damage finance facility. Next, those who focused their interventions specifically on the creation of a loss and damage finance facility detailed how it would be resourced and who would pay into it through annual contributions from developed countries, how money to countries would be triggered through nationally determined thresholds of losses and damage, and its place in the overall financial mechanism as an operating entity, and its relationship to the Warsaw International Mechanism, basically situated under the WIM and also accountable to the CMA and COP. They emphasized the importance of predictability and accessibility of finance. Finally, others spoke to loss and damage financial arrangements as a network of entities that cover the full range of loss and damage issues, noting that there are gaps in that network and elements that can be strengthened. This network includes the operating entities of the financial mechanism, as well as MDBs, IFIs, national bodies, and humanitarian arrangements. The importance of the Santiago network was also highlighted, given it will be a key element of connecting this network. Concrete examples were shared for how some existing institutions could be strengthened to improve their response to loss and damage. It was argued that this network would need to include this full range of entities in order to address both the scale of need and diversity of needs and measures to respond. A case was made that such a network would need to reduce fragmentation and improve coherence of finance, reduce unnecessary duplication, expand types of support and coverage, and accelerate delivery. That's it for me from Breakout Group 1. Joe.
Thank you, Christina. Now we move to a report back from Breakout 2, and for that we have Mr. Marcela Kekana, my friend.
Thank you, co-facilitator. Let me indicate that overall the dialogue in Breakout Group 2 was very fruitful. Many lessons were shared, challenges, constraints, and limitations, and clear solutions emerged from the group. Now, with regard to the first question on arrangements for funding, it was stressed by many parties and participants in general that there are no funding arrangements for addressing loss and damage. Participants acknowledge that insurance mechanisms do exist. However, the issues are around lack of coverage for slow onset events and non-economic losses and damages. Parametric insurance systems do not work for slow onset events. There are no triggers for sea level rise, nor for non-economic losses and damages. Premiums are not affordable. Many countries that are highly vulnerable to climate impacts cannot afford the premiums to access insurances. And many of insurance schemes are still at an experimental stage, so they are in small pilot projects in individual regions or specific sectors and have not been upscaled. However, co-facilitator, other participants highlighted that there are some funding arrangements which include a complex network of funding arrangements that extends beyond the scope of the UNFCCC. These parties highlighted their commitment and financial contribution within such arrangements, such as multilateral and bilateral funding, development assistance, and to climate finance and disaster risk reduction efforts, including early warning system to the humanitarian systems and sustainable development funding. which they all see as part of a range of elements that contribute to funding loss and damage. They recognized, however, that there needs to be greater coherence and coordination among these funds. They equally stressed the gap in current funding arrangements and financial flows. There were many examples that were given along these lines. For example, under the Green Climate Fund, some participants indicated that indeed there are indicators that cover loss of life and loss of economic assets, which are both valid for loss and damage. But indicators are lacking for losses of non-economic assets, such as cultural assets, or loss of traditional identity, etc., etc. Humanitarian response efforts and early warning system were recognized as important elements in this context to save lives. However, vulnerable households have been found to pay the majority of repairing damages and for prevention measures compared to government spending and international support. And there was a need, there was a point around interdependencies with ecosystems that are not taken into consideration. Complex ecosystem shifts are happening with possibly devastating economic impacts at regional scale. So those were some of the discussions around the first questions. And on the issue of support and lessons learned, many parties gave examples of innovations that are already happening in affected countries, e.g. On relocation trust funds, regional approaches to resettlements, coral reef insurances, and many others, and many other locally led responses and tailored approaches to local context. Participants, however, stress that international support can only have a lasting effect if people are put at the center. And the importance of a holistic systematic approach was highlighted, covering both ex-post and ex-ante approaches, avoiding fragmentation, and reach all levels of society, all economic sector in line with international principle. It was clear, co-facilitator, that there's a need to scale up support to national innovations and robust international system that can support those national innovations. Examples were given on support needed on increasing social safety nets, risk information approaches, and anticipatory action. It was also indicated some initiatives exist that offer relief after disaster, but the overall message was around scaling up of support. So on the barriers, co-facilitator, many parties stress that the current financial mechanism is not accessible to many vulnerable countries for whom the administrative burden is too great and that do not have the technical and scientific capacity that is required. In addition, the process has been not responsive enough with too long of a project lag time. For example, they indicated that project development can take around 12 to 22 months, and then there's another 24 months of approval process under the GCF, for example, and with regard to GF is completely underfunded. Current financing mechanism and modalities of the UNFCCC funds are not completely suitable for funding measures to address loss and damage. And they are simply unfit for rapid responses because they were not designed to do that. And on the last question, co-facilitator, many parties really emphasize that the dialogue needs to bring concrete outcomes on how to improve the situation and provide adequate new and additional support for those most vulnerable. in the countries to address losses and damages. Many explain that an outcome could be, for example, a finance facility for loss and damage, from which funds can be drawn quickly to support disaster-affected countries, and which should be sourced from annual contributions of developed country parties based on their historical responsibilities under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. The release of funds would be triggered by nationally determined thresholds based on the extent of losses and damages and relief needed in the affected areas. The funding will need to be predictable, stable, and easily accessible. In addition, many called for the establishment of a process that allowed to identify the needs of developing countries regarding loss and damage finance. Finally, and equally so, many other parties indicated that a deep dive is still needed in some of the areas. There were calls for early action, considering the serious challenges and innovations, and that also there is a need to address broader barriers, such as improving access to funding, speed up project development, and approval processes. So that, in a nutshell, is the report from Working Group 2, our breakout 2. Thank you, co-facilitator.
Thank you, Mr. Masela Kekana. Thank you so much for helping out in facilitating breakout group 2. Before we go to breakout group 3, which was co-facilitated myself, I will turn the floor to Mr. Ford Niergaard, who facilitated the breakout group 4. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Facilitator. From my report from Breakout Group 4, around 130 participants met in this room for an interactive discussion on the 4 questions. I encouraged an inclusive and open debate with innovative and constructive reactions to the guiding questions. I would like to thank all participants, parties and observers for having engaged in a rich exchange of views and experiences. At the end of the debate, I highlighted 2 main takeaways, and I have organized my report around these 2 main clusters of takeaways, hoping they reflect the sentiments of the discussion. They are meant as complementing each other rather than being opposing views, in my view, thereby painting a broad picture of a landscape of existing initiatives and activities, but also a landscape with critical gaps and shortcomings. The headline for the first cluster of contributions is: we do not start from scratch. Funding arrangements exist in support of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. They include humanitarian and relief response mechanisms, instruments for early actions to acute disasters and extreme weather events, and insurance and risk-sharing instruments. Such arrangements need to be scaled up. And now a set of key points under this heading. Referring to presentations at the first Glasgow dialogue session, participants recognized that there are existing funding arrangements, including the Global Climate Fund, which updated its strategic plan for 2023 and now includes schemes around averting and minimizing loss and damage, the Adaptation Fund, and institutions and organizations such as the World Bank and UNEP. There were references to the importance of insurance schemes and risk insurance facilities, such as the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility and the proposed Global Shield. Current support also includes humanitarian aid and funding for reconstruction, recovery, emergency relief, and migration-related issues. Channeling funds through existing financial mechanisms is more efficient and allows urgent action compared to establishing a new funding facility, which could be costly and take time when action is urgently needed. Finance schemes targeted towards disaster risk reduction and responding to extreme weather events have demonstrated success in minimizing and averting loss and damage. Disaster risk activities are crucial to help decision makers and practitioners gain access to hazard and exposure data, which is critical to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. Further disaster risk financing is crucial. There is a demand for response funds for immediate relief. Experience has shown that in order to support transformation and build resilience of communities, focus on long-term cash payments, social protection, and pre-finance is vital. Support that is enhancing technical and technological infrastructure capacities for observation and forecasting has been effective in responding to extreme weather events. It's permanent to work bilaterally with countries at local level to increase the level of effectiveness of loss and damage measures. Funding and support should be nationally and locally led, as any initiative must enable countries to support local priority needs and be in line with the national efforts and strategies. Comprehensive cross-sectoral approaches among countries, as well as enhancing synergies at international level and with civil society, is required to advance early action. Strengthening coordination mechanisms in countries in need of support is important. Innovative, holistic approaches that integrate traditional knowledge in research and development to inform policymaking are vital as well. And this was the setup bullet under the first cluster of the contributions. And now coming to the second cluster of contributions, which I've organized under the following heading. Existing funding and financial mechanisms are insufficient in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. If and when available, funding focuses on averting and minimizing rather than addressing. More action and support is urgently needed. And under this heading, the key points are the following. Current financing mechanisms do not recognize the urgency of loss and damage and the need to act now. It's a drop in the ocean. Existing financing mechanisms are overwhelmed. There's an urgent need to establish a funding facility for loss and damage to provide immediate help to the most vulnerable communities, which can be sourced from contributions of developing country parties based on their historical emissions. Existing financial resources and instruments at the local level are insufficient, and they have limited applicability for addressing loss and damage. As such, there is not enough funding reaching the most vulnerable communities. There should be a distinction of funding for averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and funding for adaptation. Long-term programs for slow onset events, which address restoration and rehabilitation efforts, displaced populations, loss of culture and heritage, and non-economic permanent losses are neglected and should be scaled up. Early warning systems may avert and minimize losses and damages, but they do not address the impacts of loss and damage. Funding mechanisms often focus on addressing loss and damage once the impacts are felt and are tangible, while action and support could have been more effective had it been provided earlier to prevent the impact. Not all types of losses and damages after extreme weather-related events are equally funded. Sometimes a CNN effect determines what gets funded. This should be resolved. Not all disasters after extreme weather events are covered by existing funding mechanisms. Support to the humanitarian sector should be scaled up. There are shortcomings in systems to understand data and finance gaps in responding to loss and damage. There's a lack of clarity when it comes to who makes decisions on who receives the funds and how funds are distributed. Funding to the most vulnerable countries is inaccessible due to the lengthy administrative and approval processes of financial entities that provide the funds. Loss and damage funding arrangements need to be easily accessible. Modalities and procedures in accessing funds should be efficient, streamlined, and simplified. Coordination mechanisms and support structures in countries receiving support must be strengthened to ensure effective and equitable distribution of funds. Funding mechanisms should be nationally and locally led, and support should be aligned with national programs and strategies of the countries receiving support. There are gaps in needs assessments leading to further barriers in accessing funds. And now a few final cross-cutting points. We also heard from countries sharing their experience on what has worked and what hasn't worked. We heard that with effective warning systems, lives may be saved, but not livelihoods. We learned that while some countries are successful in attracting support after a disaster has hit, neighboring countries having suffered from the same disaster may be less successful. We learned that success stories have their limits. These contributions and insights enable us to better understand practice and what works and lessons learned. The discussion also demonstrated that there is information out there, including the mapping in the ExCom technical paper from 2019, but that information gaps remain. All in all, it's my view that we had a good start of a very important conversation. I wish to thank all participants for their constructive engagement, being confident that if I made your missions, participants from Breakout Group 4 will fill in during the course of this session. Thank you very much, co-facilitator.
Thank you, Mr. Freud Nygard, for your very comprehensive report back of discussions in Breakout Group 4. And now for a report back on Breakout Group 3, which was facilitated by me. First off, I would like to thank all those who participated in my group for their contributions and very constructive engagement in the dialogue. Discussions were candid and interactive. Participants engaged with each other in good faith. And I think there is now a better understanding of the concerns and views of different groups of parties, which I think was helpful. In our group, we addressed each group separately. However, at my suggestion, the group agreed to take up questions B and D together. The reason was that these two questions seemed to be getting to the same objective, which was identifying solutions. So we kicked off our discussion on the first question, which was aimed at understanding more about the landscape of the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damages associated with the adverse impacts of climate change. But more importantly, whether they are adequate to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. We had a rich exchange of views. A key point raised by several parties was that there was a range of existing initiatives and arrangements that were individually or collectively working to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. These include the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC, bilateral assistance and investment in multilateral funds, multilateral and/or regional initiatives such as the Global Shield, risk transfer instruments such as CRIF, and social protection measures. There was broad acknowledgement that the support and funding for loss and damages there was acknowledgement that there was support and funding for loss and damages activities in general. However, many felt that the support and funding for loss and damage were A, insufficient given the needs at hand, and B, they were geared more towards averting and minimizing loss and damage. In terms of gaps, addressing loss and damage was the lost child and identified as a key problem area needing greater focus and attention. Within this ambit, slow onset events, non-economic losses, displacement, loss of assets and heritage, social protection for the vulnerable, planned relocation, etc., were identified as specific areas of concern needing more attention, support, and funding. Having identified the problem statement, as it were, we then went on to discuss question C, which was aimed, we felt, at identifying barriers and challenges faced in assessing these arrangements. Several issues were flagged. First, accessibility of funding was raised as a key issue. The lengthy, cumbersome, and bureaucratic approval process for projects was a key bugbear raised by many delegations. However, some pointed out that this problem was not unique to the funding for loss and damage activities and sought further clarification on the specificity of the issue as it pertains to loss and damage. In any case, some steps were being taken to try to address this shortcoming, such as the establishment of the task force on access to climate finance led by the UK and Fiji. Another party usefully shared that they had established a climate finance access network to help developing countries secure faster access to funds. In our group, I latched on to this and encouraged interested parties to immediately get in touch with that party to get more information on the program. I assume they did, and if so, this could be a tangible outcome emanating from our dialogue, at least in Breakout Group 3. In response to the question on why access was a peculiar problem for loss and damage, affected parties flagged that getting support for loss and damage at a time of need, particularly after a climate-related disaster, was a challenge. Existing mechanisms were not built for quick payout. While many acknowledge that disaster risk insurance schemes such as CRIF can and do help to facilitate the flows of aid at times of crisis, there were two key issues. First, premiums can be high and can add to the debt burden of countries, and there were instances where parametric triggers were not met, which meant that governments had to dig deep into their already strained budgets to fund these activities. The second issue raised was this: sustaining support post-disaster, particularly for the reconstruction phase, was a difficult challenge as well as for programs for slow onset events and non-economic and permanent losses. While many acknowledged that humanitarian aid was forthcoming in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, this support petered out soon after. Moreover, risk insurance schemes such as INSU Resilience Global Partnership Risk Transfer Instruments and other such instruments cannot cover all post-financing needs of countries. It was not easy to secure funding for the reconstruction phase to help countries build back better and forge more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive communities. Many also felt that the financial entities were not adequately funded. Third, there was low visibility and lack of information on the funding instruments. Countries and affected communities do not know what is out there. In addition, there was a lack of capacity to develop robust information systems that will allow government units, affected communities, and groups to secure access to these funds, particularly for the most vulnerable. Apart from the supply side, there was also a need to look at the demand side. A key question was whether existing funding mechanisms and solutions met the needs of those affected and channeled much needed funds and support to those most vulnerable. For this, a point was made that there was a need to take a bottom-up, customer-centric approach, focus on locally led solutions. Having identified the problem statement, some of the barriers and challenges, we then moved on into a problem-solving mode and discussed some solutions when addressing questions B and D. Here, there was a spectrum of views. On the one side of the spectrum, there was the proposal of a loss and damage financial facility. The proposed facility would be in addition to existing facilities and arrangements that should aim at the quick release of funds without any unnecessary conditionalities. On the other side of the spectrum, many pointed to the many initiatives announced, such as the Global Shield, the UN Secretary General's declaration that everyone should be protected by early warning systems in the next 5 years, existing frameworks such as the SDGs, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, as well as the plethora of multilateral, regional, and bilateral assistance schemes, and suggested that we should build on this, work to strengthen them, and find better synergies that can promote cooperation and harmony among these entities for effective delivery of assistance to those that need it. Somewhere in the middle, there was a proposal to establish a coordinating entity within the UNFCCC. There was a need for a mandate from the UNFCCC to establish an entity to coordinate efforts across UN agencies related to loss and damages. In sum, our group had a good and frank discussion on the existing funding arrangements, its gaps and challenges, and some possible solutions that could be considered. I'm very encouraged by the discussions. In my view, there is a better understanding of the gaps and key concerns held by parties, which is a good step for shaping a solution. One thing is clear, there is shared concern and desire, at least within my group, to work together to see what more could be done to help the most vulnerable affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. And this concludes the report back from my group. So, colleagues, you have heard by now the report backs from the 4 different breakout groups. I will open the floor if there are any complementary additions, views to each of the report back if you feel certain points were missing. And if not, we will have a short break, after which we will discuss the steps ahead. So can I open the floor first for any reactions, complementary views? I recognize the representative from Ango. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chairs. My name is Harjeet Singh, and I'm from Climate Action Network International. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for this exchange. We heard some of the real issues being faced by the communities and countries, but I would like us all to recognize that we are late. We are extremely late for this discussion. We knew the issue 30 years ago. Vanuatu, on behalf of AOSIS, reminded us urged us that we need to have a system in place 30 years ago. We got the Warsaw International Mechanism in 2013. This discussion should have happened in 2014, right at the beginning of the mechanism when it started putting it on the agenda. Action and support was one of the functions of the Warsaw International Mechanism. But we know how rich countries blocked the discussion. We were not even allowed to discuss some of the issues that we heard in the last few days and now in this room. These are the real issues, and we know that no support has gone from this system to help people and how big the gap is. And I would also like to remind us that we do not have a system to even know how much the gap is. We talk about mitigation gap, we talk about adaptation gap, but we do not have a system to capture loss and damage finance gap, and it is absolutely needed now. We are here to talk about people, and people are losing their homes, their farms, and income, and we have to find a way to help those people. Discussions, dialogues, and events are useful only when they result into something concrete in terms of a loss and damage finance facility to help people. Otherwise, endless talking will only kill more people and destroy their homes and farms. We do hear about many initiatives, particularly the Global Protection Shield, and we have been constructively engaging with those parties who have come up with this option, but we know it's nowhere near what is needed. It also doesn't really pass the test of the principles and parameters that we are proposing in many ways. So as civil society, we have come up with a very clear option on how to discuss this loss and damage finance facility, what kind of principles, operational modalities, and structures are needed. So we urge all parties to make sure that discussion here leads to something concrete in the form of a facility at COP27, and this discussion is captured formally in the SB's report, and we have an agenda item at COP27 to discuss it so that we don't lose any further time. And I would remind again, we have lost several years even after getting the Warsaw International Mechanism. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Representative from Angol, for your reminder of the urgency and for the need to deliver something concrete. I recognize the representative from Women and Gender. Please, you have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you so much, co-facilitator. My name is Gina Cortez Valderrama. I come from Colombia and I speak on behalf of the Women and Gender constituency. I am also echoing the words of my friend that just spoke. It has been decades of repeating the same mistakes, following a dead-end route on the map drawn on what has been called an infinite economic growth in a world of finite resources. It has been decades also framed by the legacy of colonialism, giving a free way to multiple exploitations of our territories, of our bodies, in the name of development, in the name of progress, through unfair trade, investments, or massive repression. Fossil fuel industries continues to extract our resources, erase our culture, and bury our identity. The debt owed by the global north to the global south is beyond measure. Climate debt represents centuries of unequal relations between the north and the south, between the rich and the poor, and between exploiters and exploited. Countries that have accumulated wealth on the backs of the poor continue to refuse the foot to the bill, both in terms of the actual cost of mitigations, adaptations, and especially loss and damage. This is by no means a discussion about charity or about humanitarian aid. This is by no means another opportunity to profit from the devastation of our communities with new loans or investments. We stress the need for a distinct loss and damage finance mechanism as a matter of justice. Setting up and resourcing a loss and damage fund is your opportunity to make things right by paying up for centuries of colonial extraction and plunder. Climate-induced losses and damage dramatically multiplied the social crisis in societies that are already struggling with multiple injustices. The impacts of climate disasters particularly threaten women's rights and human rights. Over 80% of the people that is currently being displaced by climate-related events are women and girls. Power imbalances, structural inequalities, and the lack of access to resources and opportunities need to be addressed with a gender lens for a transformative and possible present and future. Urgency. Gravity deserves more than just another talk, another round of discussions. Loss and damage must be on the agenda. And we do not need any more loans. We don't need any more debts. We need real accountability and justice. Thank you, Church.
Thank you so much. I recognize and I give the floor to Palestine.
Thank you, co-facilitator, and good afternoon, colleagues. Allow me to quote from the convention. The Conference of Parties, as the supreme body of this convention, shall keep under regular review the implementation of the convention and any related legal instruments that the Conference of the Parties may adopt, and shall make within its mandate the decisions necessary to promote the effective implementation of the convention. So it is our mandate to take the decisions that are necessary for the effective implementation of this convention. With regard to Glasgow dialogue, if we missed it earlier in Glasgow, we can do it now. We can remove any fog from the air and get rid of any lack of clarity on that decision or any kind of confusion on that decision. For the last few days, and including today, we hear it loud and clear from all speakers, developed as well as developing country parties, that we all are looking forward to see the report of SBI chair on the outcomes of Glasgow dialogue. Nevertheless, this mandate was not explicitly mentioned in that decision. We all hear the desperation and the frustration of lacking of clarity and the mandate for Glasgow dialogue and its outcomes. Let's decide now during this SB 56 to give this missing mandate to the co-facilitators to report back to the SBI chair and to mandate the chair to report back to the COP and CMA and to link the outcomes of the UN policy process in a coherent and systematic manner, and to have the legal instrument for Glasgow dialogue. No one can afford waiting 2 more years to have clarity on the process, pathway, or destination for Glasgow dialogue. Neither the local communities in small developing island states who are facing existential threat each day, nor the people in the Horn of Africa who are facing unprecedented consecutive drought with severe threat for their existence and livelihood. We cannot lose 2 more years of extensive consultation, dialogue, and engagement of tens and hundreds of experts, policymakers, and partners at all levels with no destination. The time is now to have the courage and take the decision to amend our earlier FOG decision and to remove any confusion from the process, pathway, destination, and the way forward. We are accountable to do so. Otherwise, our people and governments back home will start losing the trust and hope in this unique and only process to save our planet and people from the devastating and existential threat of climate change impacts. If we missed it here in Bonn, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh shall not. I thank you.
Thank you, Representative from Palestine. I see more flags coming up. I just want to remind colleagues and friends that this particular section or segment of the Glasgow dialogue this morning is aimed more at providing additional insights and views to the views already expressed from the 4 facilitators on the breakout group. there is another dedicated session slightly after this, which will address some of the points I hear coming up right now about where this process is going and the way forward. So I just thought I remind, because there will be a space for that discussion, but I'm in your hands, friends. So with that, on the list, I have Sudan, Ghana, OCHA, United States, and Pakistan. If you wish to intervene later, please let me know, but otherwise, we'll take the floor from Sudan, please.
Good morning, and I would like at the outset to thank you, the co-facilitators, and also to thank the co-facilitators of the breakout groups for their reports. The African group didn't make a statement at the opening, and for this I would like to start by underscoring with great sorrow the devastating loss and damage incidents that occurred recently and took thousands of lives in many African countries, the latest of which were associated with extreme floods, which affected a number of African countries, including South Africa, Malawi, Sudan, Mozambique, and Angola. And having said this, this is the current situation. The sense is clear and becoming clearer and related to historic and projected climate change impact. The African continent is highly concerned, as the science is telling us even at 1.5 degrees centigrade, about 25% of the African land area is projected to experience unusual heat extremes, and this rise quickly to exceed 45% in a 2-degree world. And considering the enormous losses and damage associated with that, this is alarming. In relation to the discussion and the report impact, I would like to say we confirm that there is no dedicated funding to support developing countries in addressing loss and damage. And the African countries are challenged with loss and damage on ground. The financing of loss and damage is coming from the poor household, the poor communities, and the government are challenged. And for that, they diverting the development, prioritizing development consideration and issues in favor of addressing loss and damage. And just imagine in developing and in these developed countries when you divert money away from health and development. Of course, we want to acknowledge the role of disaster risk community and the UN agencies. However, in spite of the fact that they are doing their best, providing a lot of support, however, this is just not enough. It's like a drop in an ocean because the scale of needs is quite huge. There are efforts to deal with loss and damage, but they are sporadic and experimental, and they are for dealing with just averting and minimizing. But when it comes to addressing loss and damage, there is a lot of yet to be done, particularly in the African continent. We have seen many good models that work for different parts of the world, but yet they are just few examples, and still they are still very limited experiences. The issue, like colleagues who have spoken before me, the issue of urgency and need for urgent responses in line with science to address the current and projected loss and damage, and to bridge gaps in options and approaches, because up to this moment in our region, we are challenged just with issues related to approaches associated with insurance, which is not in the hands of the poor and the vulnerable poor household and communities. The needs for funding arrangement, financing of loss and damage is really clear. There is need for new and additional unpredictable and scaled-up financing. There are a lot of issues that we need to address when we are talking about how to do that. However, we want to say that there is no one size that would fit all, that the financial arrangement, hopefully we are going to agree, should take consideration of the regional issues and should take care of what would work in different contexts. I would like to thank you.
Thank you again, Sudan, for reiterating the concerns from the African group, as well as embellishing some of the points that were included in some of the report backs by the facilitators. I pass the floor to Ghana.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Facilitator. My name is Dr. Emmanuel Tichiobin. This afternoon, I'm pleased to speak for Ghana as the current presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, CVF. The CVF Dakar Glasgow Declaration last November called for the establishment of an international dialogue on loss and damage funding arrangements. We are pleased to see this come to fruition following the final COP26 decision. In our view, the point of this dialogue is not to shelve the crucial question of funding for loss and damage for 3 years. We don't need to discuss for years to figure out what loss and damage funding should look like. Loss and damage is no new topic here. During this bond dialogue, we launched a new V20 study into historical economic loss and damage of our 55 member countries. Its main finding was that we have already lost 20% of our GDP potential this century on average. For the most at risk is our members. They would have been twice as wealthier today if not for climate change. The poorest, most vulnerable, least responsible, and least equipped nations having their scant wealth cut in half because of loss and damage. This is travesty. International Climate Change Corporation has a duty to respond to this injustice. On the bright side, equally in our new study, we presented initial evidence of fast-arriving external support actually eliminating the negative effects of GDP of certain climate disasters. Yet, until this adequate funding for loss and damage, the 1.4 billion people living in CVF countries remain constantly exposed to impact of climate emergency. Loss and damage is an emergency agenda. Indeed, it should be considered as a third pillar under the Convention in addition to mitigation and adaptation. Its funding shall be considered high in our agenda. We expect this dialogue to support coming together to ensure loss and damage is properly mandated to flow adequately, and to do so as soon as possible. Once funds are flowing, the Glasgow dialogue and its outcome should serve and share experience, learning, and to track results. COP27 must deliver on this major priority for the world's most vulnerable countries. We look forward to playing an active role in cooperation with all of you to support that outcome. Finally, the CVF wants to put on record our call for COP27 to mandate the IPCC to develop a special report on loss and damage. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, Ghana, and thank you for reminding us what is at stake: 1.4 billion people, and that's only from one vulnerable community. I turn the floor to the representative from OCHA.
Good morning. Thank you, co-facilitators, for giving me the floor. My name is Zinta Zummers, and I'm with the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs with the UN. I'd like to add some more details about the role of the humanitarian system, as this was raised in several breakout groups, as you mentioned, and OCHA was unable to make an intervention at that time. The humanitarian community can be an ally in these discussions about loss and damage finance. We have proven, impactful funding instruments and tools to respond to climate disasters in places others cannot or will not. For example, OCHA manages yearly flows of approximately $1.7 billion in the Central Emergency Response Fund and the country-based pooled funds. Already, we are spending an average of at least 26%, or $126 million annually, from one of the funds, the Central Emergency Response Funds, to address climate-related disasters. And this statistic does not include funding to respond to climate disasters in the context of conflict. We disperse funds quickly. When floods were expected in Bangladesh in 2020, we were able to release funds in 4 hours. Funds, such as the country-based pooled funds, support local organizations and civil society. And as was mentioned, we are innovating in this space through anticipatory action. Over the past 18 months, we've reached more than 2.2 million people in advance of shocks. Of course, it's clear we don't have all the solutions. We would need to further innovate or work with new partners to address gaps and areas of concerns raised here, such as non-economic losses. And we also need more finance if we are to play an active role. Last year, the humanitarian system only received 54% of the $35 billion needed to reach 255 million people in need. But we stand ready to engage in discussions going forward. And I hope that we can demonstrate the complementarity of the UN working as one. Thank you.
Thank you, OCHA, and thank you for your contributions and support for this very important cause. Just to read out the list, I have 3 more speakers, United States, Pakistan, and Palau. So, United States, please.
Thanks, and thanks to the chairs and facilitators for these last couple of days. I first did want to underscore that the United States has heard and understands the urgency that our vulnerable country partners in particular are according this issue. And we're giving real focus to this in our deliberations now at home and in our engagement here. We know that vulnerable countries and communities are confronting devastating impacts of climate change, as indeed is happening in communities across the United States as well. And we agree that we need to double down on efforts to respond and to support those who have less capability to respond themselves. So in this regard, we welcome this dialogue as an opportunity to better inform our response, and in particular to hear the specific challenges that countries have had and to engage the institutions that are involved. So we've been very pleased that we have had institutions here who've been involved in aspects of this. It was important to hear the specific challenges from the floor over the last couple of years, and also useful to have the participation of organizations in speaking specifically of the work that they are doing. We heard both specific challenges in securing funding for example, in the GCF, long timelines for project approval and the high bar for demonstrating climate rationale. Specific recommendations for adjusting the approaches of existing institutions to better respond were also put on the table. And we noted a few in the GCF context, including incorporating loss and damage into the GCF strategy, utilizing the readiness program for loss and damage needs assessments and response plans, finalizing the GCF's programmatic approach and climate rationale guidelines to make sure that the climate rationale is sensitive to the different capacities of countries, accredited entities, and the availability of data, and funding for parametric insurance. We think these recommendations all have real merit and we are interested in exploring them with our colleagues in the context of our deliberations in the GCF. We heard many other challenges and proposals that we will further consider in the wake of this session. I'd also note that since COP26, in part because of the outcome establishing the Glasgow dialogue, the United States has been focusing to respond to the specific issues and challenges that have been raised. So I can share several examples. First, we are providing support to regional risk pools, such as the ARC, through the Africa Disaster Risk Finance Program, which helps with premium subsidies. We're also pleased to join Germany in delivering the G7 outcome on the Global Shield, which will close the protection gap for vulnerable countries and communities. Second, we will respond to the UN Secretary General's call for early warning for all in the next 5 years. Early warning is important for minimizing loss and damage, as well as strengthening humanitarian responses and triggering insurance payouts. Third, many countries have raised the issue of displacement and migration. At the Summit of the Americas, which just concluded this week, we announced the Los Angeles Declaration on Migration, which includes AID and State Department's Bureau of Refugees, Population, Refugees, and Migration, announcing more than $300 million in new financing for humanitarian and development assistance for refugees and vulnerable migrants across the hemisphere, and additional support for a crisis response mechanism on migration. Working with Congress, we will provide an additional $25 million for the Global Concessional Finance Facility in this regard. Fourth, we've also heard over the last year the calls for enhanced access to MDB finance in the wake of climate-related disasters. And yesterday, in the context of the Summit of the Americas, the White House released a fact sheet that highlights efforts that we will undertake to provide greater predictability and flexibility for climate-vulnerable countries to access MDB funding following a disaster. Specifically, we are looking at options to expand the use of MDB debt deferment clauses to create additional fiscal states to address or to respond to shocks, considering expanding access to MDB funding in the wake of major climate-related disasters to countries that have otherwise graduated from such access, and seeking to improve the transparency on criteria for accessing International Development Association assistance in the wake of climate-related disasters. We will be doing a number of other things in the context of regional MDBs as well. So just finally, as a general matter, we see this dialogue and the exercise as helping us to know how to maximize the opportunities to enhance support for loss and damage. So we're still in the mode of understanding the landscape and coming to a settled view about the right approaches. We are convinced that this process will ultimately involve strengthening and aligning all of the relevant institutions, including operational entities, MDBs, risk pools, humanitarian aid, and development sector and other institutions so that they are responsive to the issues and measures raised here. There's been a compelling case made that a focus on stronger coordination and mobilization of this network of institutions can both reduce fragmentation and prevent duplication, but also expand coverage and scale and accelerate delivery, and we're very interested in doing that. I would also underscore that we believe there's unquestionably a critical role for improving actions in the institutions under the financial mechanism. We don't think this necessarily equates to a new fund, given the architecture that we have already. I would note, however, that we and many others have emphasized the imperative of broadening the donor base in any efforts that we undertake in our process henceforth. And this is especially true on this issue, given global emissions and investment patterns. And it's simply not tenable to think that the source of contributions to this effort will come solely from traditional contributors if there's to be the kind of broad, effective response that many want. And finally, I would underscore the critical imperative for issues pertaining to loss and damage finance of averting loss and damage through 1.5 Celsius aligned emission reductions in this critical decade. It doesn't make sense to focus on substantial new funding for loss and damage without also having a strong set of actions by all designed to keep 1.5 within reach. We are not there yet, and we think it's critical that we continue to attach urgency to that issue in our process along with this one. So we look forward to continuing to engage with all of you on these issues and to find solutions and ways to respond to this critical issue. Thank you.
Thank you, the US. And I turn the floor to Palau.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Co-Chair, I also like to, like my previous speaker, I'd like to thank you and the co-facilitators for the breakout group. And responding to your instructions, I'd just like to give an example of the long onset on loss and damage. In the Pacific, Palau is part of the Pacific Small Island Developing State. In the Western Pacific, we control nearly 60% of the tuna stocks in the world. Tuna stocks. So most likely, if you ever go to a store and you buy a tin tuna, it most likely came from the Pacific. And in the Pacific, there's about 14, 15 Pacific Island countries regionally that we depend on those tuna stocks. And we do have regional organizations that help us develop the management and the sustainability of these tuna stocks. And in the Pacific, these tuna agreements account for either a third or a half of national budgets for each of the small island Pacific countries. Because in the Pacific, it's either we have tuna fisheries, agriculture, or tourism. Those are our three main income generator. And now with the slow onset of ocean acidification, sea surface temperature, it's predicted, and we witnessed it also by the IPCC report recently in a 1.1 global world, these tuna stocks will migrate elsewhere. Now imagine if these tuna stocks migrate beyond our region. Imagine what that will do to the national budgets. It will reduce them by a half or a third. And when you do that, then national budget services for health, education, social services will be reduced. So for us, the issue of loss and damage is not only pertain to like each individual, but it also affects us at a regional level. But more importantly, it affects our national budget. And so this is the issue that I just want to share and complement. And I want to thank the co-facilitator for Group 2 from South Africa. I think he did a fantastic job. But I just want to share that with you because when it comes to loss and damage, yes, we're talking about humanitarian aid and so forth, but our national budget also depends on the slow and onset. And I just want to share that as an example to give us that flavor of how we move forward in this session. So thank you very much, Co-Chair, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Palau, for the additional insight on the impacts of loss and damage to climate change on vulnerable communities. And through you also, I just want to thank South Africa again for the good job he did. Just to double check, we had Pakistan on the list, but would you still like to intervene because we noticed you put your flag down?
Thank you, Co-Facilitator. I can intervene now as well, but I think my comments are more pertaining to the segment 2, and you already indicated that there will be a segment 2 shortly, so I can restrict my comments for the next segment. Thank you.
Thank you, Pakistan. And over to you, New Zealand.
Thank you, co-facilitators and colleagues, for the rich exchanges this week. What we have heard from colleagues and from the science is that despite adaptation efforts, loss and damage is now part of our lives and hurting our communities. This is particularly true in New Zealand's own region, the Pacific, where vulnerability to the impacts of climate change is extreme and loss and damage is an existential threat. We heard examples in the workshop that include destruction by tropical cyclones, revenue loss from climate-induced fisheries migration. Thank you to our colleague from Palau for explaining this so well. And we heard of the cultural, psychosocial, and financial costs of relocating communities. These misfortunes are falling on all of us, but mostly on economies that are very small and very fragile. The proportion of available revenue sucked up by responding to climate change-related events delays, defers, and derails their sustainable development objectives. This is particularly true of the experiences we have been hearing about from our Pacific colleagues. While many of us understand adaptation in a broad way, including the actions that respond to loss and damage, some of the impacts that cause loss and damage are not the kind we can adapt to and move on from. Sometimes we have to start over. These restart responses may require the relocation of whole communities or developing new economic opportunities. They are responses that drain national resources hardest and may need to be repeated over and over again. Colleagues highlighted on Wednesday some of the responses to loss and damage that are already on the radar for receipt of funding support. For example, we heard about regional insurance schemes and early warning systems. But what this week has underscored for us is that there remain a number of barriers to financing loss and damage response. 3. One is access to finance, having the capacity to jump the hoops to get projects approved. In many cases, a single project is not even the right answer. We need to look for programmatic approaches to respond to loss and damage. Second, another related issue is timeliness. Having the right kind of finance at the right time and not needing to wait many months for finance that is needed for recovery post-disaster. And thirdly, eligibility. We here are committed to supporting developing countries' adaptation and mitigation needs. How or whether restart responses are covered by adaptation funding is still an open question. That is, the addressing of loss and damage. We've also heard the need to scale responses to loss and damage that are not only finance, including capacity building and technological interventions. And likewise, we hear the need to optimize available technical support. So where does this leave us? And how can we move forward towards finding solutions that ensure funding is available to address loss and damage? From New Zealand's standpoint, there should be no question climate finance must be available to avoid, minimise and address loss and damage. We don't yet have all the solutions for loss and damage finance. We don't yet know what the solution or solutions need to be. We want to encourage creativity and flexibility in finding responses to the call for dedicated finance. We want to explore options in order to find good outcomes for those who are most vulnerable. We think the solutions may lie in bilateral, regional and multilateral solutions within and outside the UNFCCC framework. At the same time, we need to do this urgently. Thinking hard and exploring options must not become delay and procrastination. We hope that the Santiago Network and the continuation of the Glasgow Dialogue can help us identify and advance solutions. At the same time, we must not waste finance and impact through duplicated institutions, nor should we undermine established adaptation finance processes. Aotearoa New Zealand wants to see a fair, equitable and transparent process to find solutions on loss and damage. And we hope all here today can assist with facilitating this promptly through the UNFCCC process and more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, New Zealand. On your last comment about transparent process, this process is cast on the web. The breakout groups are on the web, so it's transparent, let me assure you. But thank you for your contributions. And we have 2 more speakers on the list, and I think I will close the list here so we can move on to the next section. We have India first, and then Colombia, who will have the last word. So, India, please.
Thank you, co-facilitator. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the briefs from all the 3 breakout groups. I think to begin, Glasgow Dialogue has been a great learning platform. It has opened a dialogue. We understand each other much better before the dialogue started. And we are more aware about what the phenomena is, what the possible solutions could be. Just borrowing from the recently released Global Assessment Report of DRR 2022. And there's a statement at the first statement in the report by the UN Secretary General reads that nothing undermines sustainable development like disasters. They can destroy decades of progress in an instant. And just to quote the figure, it has already risen from 400 disasters per year in 2015 to 560 disasters per year in 2021. 40% increase in number of disasters. The losses, almost 145% increase in losses. 2010 losses are pegged at $170 billion. So that is the magnitude of the problem. We just want to submit that the attribution is clear, the science is clear. Loss and damage is a reality, leading to food security, health crisis, cities going under floods. The problem is that the intensity, the frequency of the extreme weather events, particularly the hydrometeorological events, are rising very rapidly. They are happening in new areas where they never used to happen. But the main problem is that there is an unequal distribution of the impacts of disasters. We all are in it together, but the mortality figures, as shown by the first presentation, Reinhard was talking about 90%, and that presentations thereafter talked about 90% of the mortality of human lives happening in the developing countries. So the problem is with the unequal distribution of the disasters, the problem is with the unequal impact on human lives and property because of the disasters. And borrowing from the Paris Agreement, the 3 important words, avert, minimize, and address. I totally agree with some of the submissions by the parties here, that we have options in adaptation financing and mitigation financing and all the other instruments to look at mitigation and minimizing disasters. Averting is a very limited role now. Averting is almost disappearing. Averting is like avoiding disasters. That is not a reality. My emphasis is on addressing loss and damage. And as I've heard a lot of parties, addressing loss and damage initially starts with a shock, with an immediate relief, with humanitarian aid. That is very important if you're helping humanity and helping other parties. But doesn't stop there. It doesn't become business as usual after the disaster has happened. And that is the important portion. That is where addressing comes into picture. And addressing would make sure it is not only relief and response, addressing is also recovery and reconstruction, the post-disaster needs assessment. We all talk about build back better. That is very critical. The support is required by the affected countries and communities in building back better, in recovering and reconstructing better, in resettling and rehabilitating better, in finding out new livelihood strategies and survival strategies. The problem of addressing is quite critical to capture in the Glasgow dialogue, and that is very important to understand. So the technology available and the finances available could very well also look at early warning that people have been talking about. That's so critical, and I'm grateful to some of the parties to having said that early warning would be available to all the communities, all the parties in the world in a timeline. The technology is there, the science is there, predictions could be made. It should reach the last person who is going to be affected by a disaster. That last minute dissemination is very critical for a disaster scenario. And that is what a lot of technology and funds would be required for. It could also be required for a lot of preparedness for the communities themselves, because if disasters are a reality, preparedness is the only solution. And preparedness at the first responder, at the local level, they need to be prepared much better. So funds and technology and capacity building is now required to prepare the communities better to face disasters. So that is very important to capture. We don't have the luxury to get into disaster risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, but we certainly need to prepare the communities better. We also need to, it has already been flagged, I'll keep that reserved for my submission in the next session about the way forward, but we certainly need for much easier, less complicated, faster dispersal of grants. We don't have the luxury of making large proposals for a year and getting it sanctioned. Resettlement and rehabilitation, recovery, reconstruction requires immediate grants. So I'll reserve those submissions about the way forward on the financing and other outcomes for the next session. So I'll stop now. Thank you, Co-Facilitator, for the chance.
Thank you, India, also for your very valuable contributions. And we have the last speaker for this section. So Colombia, please.
Thank you very much, Co-Facilitator. Colombia speaks on behalf of ILAC. Colleagues, this week, the ILAC group has engaged in good faith in the Glasgow dialogue established in the Glasgow Climate Pact. During the dialogue, we have heard firsthand from many developing countries how climate change has already caused significant loss and damage to their people, livelihoods, ecosystems, culture, economies, and many others. This fact was one of the major messages from the Working Group 2 contributions to the IPCC 6 assessment report. Some major conclusions can be drawn from what we heard during the dialogue. First, there is already work that is being carried out related to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and some finance is directed to these activities that are being carried out. However, big financial gaps exist in all these areas, most especially when it comes to addressing loss and damage. Second, there are also major gaps related to the appropriate consideration and funding for actions related to non-economic loss and damage, as well as loss and damage that results from slow onset events. Third, it has been very clear that those who are bearing the burden of the cost of loss and damage are the most vulnerable people, households and communities, as well as the economies from developing countries. Fourth, there is a problem of scale, provided that needs for developing country parties on loss and damage start in 580 billion by 2030 and end up in 1.7 trillion by 2050. Fifth, there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close global investment gaps. As the IPCC showed in its presentation the first day of the dialogue, and as we have witnessed to these 2 last years, the recovery packages for COVID flowed in a few months and amounted to 12 trillion. 6, around 80% of financial instruments being used for climate action take the form of loans and are factually reducing developing countries' fiscal space to invest in climate action and also deepening our levels of indebtedness that cannot continue to be exacerbated. Loans should not be considered in the future as an option for loss and damage finance. As a conclusion of this first dialogue and all these reflections, ILAC considers it is fundamental to determine the loss and damage financial arrangements that will foster the necessary international collaboration by taking into account the financing gaps outlined by all in the last days, as well as the inadequacy of insufficiency of existing minimal financial arrangements for some aspects of loss and damage. Thank you very much, co-facilitator.
Thank you very much, Colombia, again, which I think is pretty apt to end this session because it teases out some of the points that were already raised in the report backs by different groups. Colleagues and friends, we had originally planned for a 5 to 10 minute bio break, but I think in view of the very interesting discussions and engaging contributions by many parties, we will move straight away to the next section or segment. But before we do so, I also want to recognize many heads of delegations are here in this meeting room, which reflects again the importance of this issue, and we want to acknowledge their presence. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to my co-facilitator, Christina, who will take us through the next and very important part of the discussion on Glasgow Dialogue, which is the way forward. Christina.
Thank you so much, Joe, and thank you to all the previous interventions. We're entering the last hour of the Glasgow Dialogue at this session, and I want to pivot us to next steps. I want to be mindful that there are ongoing discussions and consultations happening with the SBI chair with regard to one important aspect of next steps. For this next hour, I wanted us to focus on next steps in the sense of what to take from these rich discussions into the next dialogue scheduled next year. On the first day of the Glasgow Dialogue here, we heard interventions from the floor about wishes to provide input from parties to the program for the future dialogue. So now is the time to hear that input and how you would like to see this next dialogue with regard to topics, themes, as well as structure, and what worked here that we might want to repeat and where we can improve. So with that, I'd open the floor. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, co-facilitators, and again I want to acknowledge your leadership on this issue and the recent discussions on the loss and damage, and I think as Joseph highlighted, the fact that the importance of this reflects the fact that delegations and heads of delegation are very actively engaged in this, and not only through these forums, but their outreach with different groups and bilaterally. I think hearing the feedback from the different groups in itself, I think, has highlighted the benefit of the dialogue, and I think I want to acknowledge, as India and others have said, that it has provided an opportunity to build a better understanding around where different parties' concerns, frustrations around the issue are in terms of progress, but equally importantly, what are some of the solutions in terms of how we take this forward. I think also just reflecting what's been beneficial is having the voice of different parties. I think the UFCCC sometimes can be insular, and I think having the voice of civil society, hearing the views of NGOs, UN and development agencies, I think is critical because, frankly, as been highlighted, the loss and damage issue is one that needs more resources, more engagement, if we're going to be able to address the increasing challenges we face. I think as the IPCC's highlighted, the challenges we face in loss and damage are only growing, and for that reason, it's going to need for us to look at how we're not only delivering the existing mechanisms and funding as effectively as possible, but how we're expanding that and drawing in greater resources. I think from Australia's perspective, in terms of the next steps on it, I think one of them is, as the Glasgow dialogues are identified, one, how do we increasingly ensure that the initiatives of funding and the mechanisms that are focused on loss and damage are pivoting, aligning their efforts to local, national government priorities, and that that is as being as effective as possible as the impact of climate change is coming forward. Secondly, identifying then how additional financing and funding, one is what is needed, but increasingly how that is going to most effectively meet the needs. And that comes to the question then of what the next steps on that are. And I think from our perspective, I think jumping to a solution around a global facility within the UNFCCC assumes the outcomes and what's coming forward from the Glasgow dialogue, and particularly in terms of identifying what might be the most fit-for-purpose mechanisms for additional financing to come through. We're hearing the frustrations that are coming from slow disbursement, inefficiency, lack of joined-up approaches from global funds and mechanisms. So surely we need to ensure that whatever mechanisms are established are going to allow that quick responsive alignment at a local level, at a national level, and where need be at a regional and multilateral level. And I'd very much align ourselves with the comments that New Zealand made on this in terms of how we take this forward. Finally, I think is the issue about how we're more inclusive. How we're more inclusive in addressing this issue of loss and damage, and how greater financing can be coming from traditional development partners, but equally from new emerging donors and players who are going to have to play an increasing role on this. And I want to acknowledge the leadership and work of India on this, on the Coalition Disaster Resilience Infrastructure and the initiative on small island development states. Australia's providing $10 million of financing into that, and I know other donors are also coming in. But I think it's a good model where there's financing coming in from developed and developing countries to look at how we collectively understand and deal with the impacts climate change is having, both from an adaptation and a loss and damage perspective. We look forward to continuing to engage in the Glasgow dialogues. We look forward to hearing the views of civil society, of our developing country partners, particularly in the Pacific, and we look forward to how we can together find an ambitious outcome going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Australia. I just want to emphasize the point you made on the importance of ensuring voices and a variety of voices in this dialogue next. Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pakistan is speaking on behalf of the Group of 77 in China. As the group has said in Glasgow and now here in Bonn, the G77 in China is united in its ask for the establishment of a dedicated loss and damage finance facility as intended tangible outcome to which the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage must contribute. We have been on record to emphasize on the need for issue of loss and damage finance to be squarely and concretely addressed. For some of our members, they have been calling for this for more than 25 years. The work that we'll undertake under the Glasgow Dialogue must be in this direction. Doing so will be a historic and significant step towards this solidifying and enhancing international cooperation on loss and damage under the Convention and its Paris Agreement. For the discussions at this session's Glasgow Dialogue, it is clear that funding gaps to address loss and damage need to be addressed. This means ensuring that all ex-post financing is made available for developing countries to address loss and damage, Such financing is not yet available through the existing funding arrangements under the Convention and the Paris Agreement's financial mechanisms. This needs to be worked on. It will represent a clear response that all parties, both developed and developing countries, share the common resolve to resolve loss and damage together as global partners under the Convention and its Paris Agreement. Our discussions here at Glasgow Dialogue should also send a clear signal to the world, to those who are marginalized and most vulnerable and are calling for our help, that the parties are prepared to concretely act to put in place the funds and institutional arrangements needed under the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and that is to effectively address climate change-related loss and damage in developing countries. To send this signal, the discussion at this Glasgow Dialogue needs to be in a written report that could be then considered by the COP and the CMA as a contribution to the discussions on establishing the loss and damage finance facility as proposed at COP26 by the G77 and China. We look forward to continuing the work towards this tangible outcome on finance and funding arrangements for loss and damage at this session and at the COP/CMA. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Pakistan. Next, Japan.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair, for giving me the floor. Japan welcomes this first Glasgow dialogue on the arrangement of financing the activity to avert, minimize, address loss and damage associated with adverse effect of climate change. Active discussion have been made last 2 days, and today we hope to find a way forward for the next round of Glasgow dialogue. Japan is also a natural disaster-prone country, and we have damaged by typhoon, and most recently in September 2019, a typhoon hit Japan and causing 40 deaths and 4,000 houses are damaged by flood. So we share the serious concerns of the developing country, especially small island developing states, and this emerging and urgent need to address loss and damage. We hope that we address their concerns seriously. Disaster prevention and disaster risk reduction indeed are one of Japan's major areas of assistance to the developing countries. On the other hand, we have noticed the last 2 days' discussion that the spectrum of loss and damage is quite large. One side, direct human and material damage by disaster, and also other losses by strong onset events and non-economic damage. And we have not yet cleared details of these sub-elements on loss and damage, including their characteristics, degree of damage, and modality to address these damages, etc. We need to continue to deepen our discussion to clear this point. I hope that this Glasgow dialogue can help us dive into this element. Also, we have noticed and found in this dialogue, wide range stakeholders are already conducting their activities related to loss and damage, especially operating entity of finance mechanism, adaptation fund, World Bank. We have had a briefing from them, and other UN agency and also MDBs conduct various assistance in this regard. And also we just hear the United States and other developed countries carrying out this assistance. And Japan do the assistance in this regard. The problem we face now is these issues, these assistance are not well articulated nor calibrated to effectively address this issue of loss and damage. So it's important to take up appropriate assistance to effectively address these different needs. I believe this is no one-fit-all approach here. We expect that the next Glasgow dialogue, we can discuss in detail about these particular issues. Japan takes note of the call by several developing countries, including EOSIS, on the establishment of a dedicated finance facility to loss and damage. We are afraid that such facilities requires quite large amount of resources and time to establish. For example, we remember that GCF was decided to establish in 2010 at COP16 decision, but it took 5 years to get started and 8 years to get fully operational. We don't think we have such abundant time for addressing these urgent issues. Japan rather considered that as a first step, we need to approach the relevant institutions, including climate fund, such as GCF and Adaptation Fund, to strengthen their needs, strengthen their assistance to avert and minimize address loss and damage. In particular, GCF is operating the entity of the financial mechanism of the Convention and the Paris Agreement, and the COP has the authority to give its guidance to the GCF. Indeed, last guidance to GCF adopted at COP26. Several inputs are from WIM EXCOM and parties, and included in the guidance. And now we understand that GCF is addressing these elements. And we also now discussing the adaptation fund in terms of force review of the fund. So we may consider that issues in that regard. We acknowledge that many developing countries are not completely satisfied with the activities of GCF. But we need to distinguish several human factors and with structural issues. We see that governance and the policy related to programming and implementation of the GCF are now being well developed, including a simplified approval process policy, which was adopted at the last GCF board in Antigua Barbuda. We believe that GCF has the capacity to further strengthen its assistance to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. Japan is one of the contributors to the GCF, amounting to $3 billion in total, and also we part of the GCF board. We remain engaged in the process, and it allows the GCF to carry out its assistance to effectively respond to these important issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Japan. Next on the list is Switzerland.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank you, Madam Chair, and your co-chairs, and the facilitators of the group, and all partners indeed, for the really rich and good discussion. We really appreciated the constructive discussion and sharing of views, and thought the breakout groups were a very useful modality that allowed for a more solution-oriented interaction. We believe that this is a format that should be repeated in future. We fully agree that loss and damage is an urgent challenge reflecting fundamental needs. It is also clear that this challenge needs an effective response. As said by several, including New Zealand, Australia, and also just the G77 and Japan, finance must be available and accessible to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. And we need to find the right and effective framework to ensure this. In our work towards this dialogue was indeed very helpful. We have learned a lot from this interaction and from this first moment of deep reflection. First conclusions include that there are institutions able to finance loss and damage, and several of them are also financing addressing loss and damage. However, it has also become clear that the current resources are not sufficient to address the increasing needs. Moreover, the existing response mechanisms to some of the areas falling under loss and damage, such as slow onset events, are not yet sufficiently clear. And access for all vulnerable countries in need of support remains also a challenge. We sincerely hope that the next round of this dialogue will build on this first round, will help us to further deepen our reflections and help us to better understand not only the challenges created by the climate crisis, but most importantly, also effective solutions to them. Namely, it also became very clear that we need to dig deeper into the issues given the broad scope of averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage, and that would be helpful in future sessions of the dialogue to have some deep dives on specific issues. 2 examples. First, breaking down some of the key broad areas discussed under losses damage, such as slow onset events or non-economic losses, into subtopics, as these are very diverse, from displacement and biodiversity loss to culture and identity loss, to name just some. And each of these involve different actors and will require different solutions. Secondly, addressing some of these specific accessibility issues faced with sources of financing relevant to loss and damage, in particular to make sure that these mechanisms and schemes reach to the most vulnerable communities. Having heard the particular needs in terms of addressing loss and damages ex post, we would also encourage the SBI chair for the next dialogue to invite actors with specific expertise in the resilience to recovery and reconstruction spectrum. We also concur with others on the urgency of the matter. As IPCC reminded us in his working group 2 reports, losses and damages are already occurring, and with increasing global warming, losses and damages increase and become increasingly difficult to avoid, while strongly concentrated among the poorest vulnerable populations. For COP27, we therefore hope for a strong deliverable on the Santiago network, which has the potential to increase technical assistance for averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage and make it more efficient. We look forward to making strong progress in the institutional arrangements of the Santiago network here and in Bonn. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Switzerland, and thank you especially for providing some specifics on what you would like to see brought into the next dialogue. Antigua Barbuda, you are next.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator, and good day to colleagues. First, I'll be speaking on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States. Firstly, I think we should reflect on the last 2 days, and we did wait to come at the appropriate time, as you highlighted, to look at the way forward, but I think it's a good way for us to look forward is to reflect back, as you instructed us to do. So colleagues, at the start of the first day of the Glasgow dialogue, we reiterated our reservation from COP26. This was that our group acquiesced to the Glasgow dialogue decision on the condition that it would lead to a conclusion that a loss and damage finance facility would be established at the next COP, and that would be this COP in Egypt, COP27. This was the basis on which we understood the decision to establish the Glasgow dialogue. From day one, the Glasgow dialogue sought to set the scene, so we set the scene. We heard stories from the most vulnerable countries, including that really excellent story from our colleague from Palau. In the world, sharing realities from their homes. Similarly, the subsequent presentation by the IPCC report findings are unambiguous, and I repeat, unambiguous. vulnerable countries will not be able to adapt to the warming beyond the 1.5 limit. We are quickly reaching, and in some cases have reached, the hard limits of adaptation. Time is of the essence. The window to secure a livable, sustainable future for all is rapidly closing. Hence, urgency should underline all efforts to address this. We constructively participated only to showcase the existing gaps in the funding arrangements that we have been reiterating over the last 30 years, but also the extensive work in this area that has already been completed under our process, under this UNFCCC process. And it is evident that, one, most funding arrangements do not provide climate finance that address all loss and damage from both types of events, collectively or individually. And two, the existing, and if existing arrangements do provide financing, not climate financing, to address some loss and damage, it does not qualify as climate finance, in line with the relevant provisions of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And there's some key characteristics that were highlighted today in many of the reflections. And this includes that climate finance is, first of all, new and additional to both development finance and humanitarian assistance. And that all developing countries, all, are eligible to access the funds. Additionally, existing arrangements currently do not address many loss and damage response activities, and these include, among others, planned relocation for affected people and measures to address permanent loss of, among other things, ecosystems and heritage. Co-facilitator, from the interventions by parties, there is consensus in the room. All parties and presenters made it abundantly clear that there are significant gaps. These are both in terms of the funding arrangements themselves, but as well, we talked about scale and the scale of finance that is required. It is now time to move to establishing the loss and damage finance mechanism facility and working towards its operationalization. On the way forward, I can only reiterate the group position that we acquiesce to the Glasgow dialogue decision on the condition that it would lead to the conclusion of the loss and damage finance facility established at the next COP, this coming COP. AOSIS reiterates its view that the Glasgow dialogue should be party-driven, country-driven. AOSIS wishes to approach and to provide these approaches under two tracks for the Glasgow dialogue going forward. One is procedural and one is substantive. On the procedural aspect, parties and non-party stakeholders are provided with an opportunity to provide their input into the agenda for the dialogue in 2023. And this should happen sometime post COP27 in early 2023. The SPI chair, in consultation with the ExCom, would propose the agenda for the Glasgow dialogue based on the discussions that we parties and non-party stakeholders have had here in 2022, as well as inputs that I just highlighted from parties before. And then the third thing on procedure is a synthesized set of reporting from the dialogue that will be able to capture the views of parties and non-party stakeholders. From the substantive side, and looking at the focus of the Glasgow dialogue, after the last 2 days, we agree again that there are gaps. Hence, following the establishment of the loss and damage finance facility in COP27, and noting that very clearly, The second year of the dialogue could focus on innovative funding arrangements for filling the gaps identified in Dialogue 1. So we propose the following guiding questions. What are potential approaches for addressing the gaps in finance available for addressing loss and damage, and focusing squarely on addressing? What are the organizations that can help to support the implementation and scaling up of those potential approaches? And the last guiding question would be, what are the institutional arrangements and enabling environments that are needed to be in place to facilitate implementation and scaling up of these potential approaches? Colleagues, I mentioned it in the breakout room, that we need to stop mistaking motion, moving around pieces on a chessboard, for actual action on this matter. We need a loss and damage facility to address the loss and damage that we face. And I'll just say one thing in my national capacity. We have tried hard to reform in the past the existing arrangements, and the door was shut in our face many times. Colleagues, the facility is, among other things, a manifestation of us being ignored and trivialized. The facility is our opportunity to get it right, and to get it right collectively, and make an effective first start in establishing a comprehensive solution to the issue that we face. Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, Antigua and Barbuda, on behalf of AOSIS. Next on my list is Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. Good morning, Excellencies, friends and colleagues. Timor-Leste would like to speak on behalf of the LDCs on this matter. The question on way forward is critically important for at least the LDCs and all of developing countries. In the past 2 days of the dialogue, we have heard much about the current financing landscape for loss and damage within and outside the UNFCCC. We have heard repeatedly that large gaps remain and that the current financial support is severely limited and largely focused on averting, minimizing, but actually not addressing loss and damage. We have heard nothing that we have not known for the decades now, but we still have no clear way forward to take important decisions needed on the establishment of a loss and damage financial facility. We ran out of time in Glasgow as we were negotiating the decision on finance facility. We are not happy with this specific aspect of the Glasgow Act's outcome, and we were not happy that we had no time to negotiate how to take the outcomes of the dialogue forward and up on them. However, the LDCs group, along with the 77 and China, had concessionally agreed to this with the understanding that Glasgow dialogue would result in the establishment of a financial facility for address loss and damage. Moving ahead, the LDC position support the 77 and China proposal of a separate agenda item being established on the Glasgow dialogue for substantive discussion at COP27 in Egypt. The outcome document of this dialogue prepared by the SBI chair should be considered by the parties in Sharm el-Sheikh under a formal agenda item. We also demand that such agenda items be established after each subsequent Glasgow dialogue at COP28 as well as COP29. Additionally, going forward, it will be vital that we are precise and transparent in the process of this dialogue. We would like to request the parties be included from the start in developing the agenda for the next dialogue. Going forward, it will also be vital that we are precise and transparent in the context of the discussion ahead.
Thank you, Timur.
We need to differentiate between averting, minimizing loss and damage and addressing loss and damage. Simply said, we need to distinguish between adaptation financing and loss and damage financing. The dialogue in 2023 needs to be making a clear distinction in this regard that I just mentioned before. Clear and split attention should be paid to financing activities to address the aftermath of extreme events, the irreversible and certain impacts of slow onset events, and addressing non-economic losses and damages that are facing by developing countries. Only then it will be able to truly advance this discussion in a fair and equitable manner under the provisions of the Convention and its Paris Agreement. I would like to add that the LDCs are among the developing countries who have a limited capacity to address losses and damage. So we are also hearing from this forum that some of developed country parties, they have different, or they have similar losses and damage that they are facing at the moment. But in terms of capacity, we have a limited capacity to do so. Once again, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Timor-Leste. On behalf of the LDCs, next I have Fiji.
Thank you, co-facilitators. Fiji would like to acknowledge the co-facilitators for their work over the past few days. We know this has been no easy task, especially with the objective of the Glasgow dialogue being so unclear. Fiji wishes to align with the statements and sentiments put forward by IOSIS and the G77 and China. While Fiji does not support the open-ended nature of this exercise and has felt slightly unnerved by some of the perceptions that have been offered in the discussions, which suggest some underlying definitional issues to the way some are approaching loss and damage, we do see hope that ensuing instances of this dialogue can contribute to our broader objectives through the proposals put forward by IOSIS. We agree it is important that we establish the means for parties to inform the questions and focus of the dialogue. We also must agree on the synthesized reporting requirements for capturing the outcomes of these dialogues. I now wish to bring attention to some of the key messages Fiji wishes to see perpetuated based on what we have heard and said. We need to ensure that the preemptive measures offered by traditional risk financing instruments such as catastrophe drawdown options or emergency preparedness measures such as early warning systems are not conflated with situations where irrecoverable loss has occurred. We have more or less understood that the intent through existing adaptation and mitigation related funding streams, whether effective or not, is to minimize and avert loss and damage at varying degrees. It is clear that there are gaps within those financing areas and objectives, but that those are not the specific gaps we wish to discuss here. Financing for loss and damage, in Fiji's view, needs to be distinct from the structures and mandates of existing climate financing arrangements. This is about financing that addresses loss and damage that has occurred and not that may occur. It is also about addressing irrecoverable losses and non-economic loss. It is about what is lost, not what could be lost. There is a very distinct reactive ex-post element to these funding needs. Loss and damage financing is about addressing fundamental losses to livelihood, culture, and tradition when a community must abandon land. Loss and damage is the financing required to support businesses that have lost their source of value, the crops that will no longer grow due to saltwater intrusion, the bleached and rubbled reefs that divers no longer wish to explore. To link these needs with statements that reference early warning systems is to fundamentally miss the point. It's like an airbag going off after a car accident that has occurred. Finally, if we are to move forward, it is imperative that at the very least, this dialogue helps eradicate the conflation between terms, timeframes, operative distinctions, and financing typologies. It is also recognized through the dialogue that many parties agree that adding the sensitivities and complexities of loss and damage to the already dysfunctional national climate financing infrastructure is a decidedly problematic suggestion. While efforts to systematically reform the issues we have with these funding arrangements and their ability to avert and minimize loss and damage are urgently needed, suggesting that financing of loss and damage simply be treated through a new window in the GCF is somewhat perverse and speaks to the misinterpretations discussed a moment ago. Financing for loss and damage cannot simply be a new financing flavor with different project objectives. It needs to be treated, understood, governed, and deployed differently than the financing for risk, preemptive, and responsive activities. Financing for loss and damage may not result in the photo opportunities or glossy completion reports that donors seek. It will certainly not be imbued with the sort of positivity linked to the financing of a new solar array or the construction of a climate resilient school. But without it, those efforts will themselves be curtailed by the losses that eat away at public funds, resources, and capacity. Financing for loss and damage should not be financed through traditional ad hoc donor pledging. We cannot depend on that. In Fiji, we have established a trust fund for the planned relocation of communities, which, with the exception of contributions from a few close partners, has been largely left empty since it was established in 2019. It's too sensitive, too risky to fund relocation, we hear. In response, we suggest that loss and damage needs to be financed through a more systematic approach. We need to look at levies, carbon taxes, and other sources of additional financing that do not rely solely on goodwill. Some suggest that this would be too great an ask. Yet, with fossil fuel subsidies injecting over 11 million USD dollars a minute into enhancing rather than addressing loss and damage, we beg to differ with that assessment. Global disaster-related losses in 2021 have been estimated to 280 billion US dollars. Yet in 2020 and 2021, parties failed to meet the 100 billion USD global financing goal. Having an open-minded dialogue on loss and damage may be frustrating for those that are experiencing it. It can feel like we are discussing these issues to double-check they're indeed real. These stats are publicly available. Lastly, it is clear that we are no longer debating whether loss and damage is an issue. It is also clear that there is emergent consensus that there are key gaps in relation to financing to address climate-induced loss and damage. So that leaves us with the question of how loss and damage will now be formally addressed, financed, and treated in the UNFCCC process. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiji. I have 9 speakers on the list and a half hour left in this session, and we would like, Joe and I would like to give the floor to the SBI chair for some closing remarks. So with that, I am going to close the list, but before I do, I just want to read who is on the list. So I have next is European Union, and after that, Vanuatu, the Marshall Islands. I have an observer, Mexico, Colombia, Jamaica, India, Sudan, Chile, and South Africa. I hope I didn't miss anyone. Ghana, Canada. So the Secretariat is picking up the rest of the flags that went up while I was reading, and then closing the list then. We have a half hour, less than half hour left, so I do encourage you to be as brief as you can, understanding how important this issue is, but with 30 minutes left. Thank you, EU.
Thanks very much, Christina, and thanks, Joe, to both of you for your work in co-facilitating this challenging process, and welcome Marianne to the podium. We are both looking back and looking forward. We think that the past 2 days of dialogue have been very helpful in advancing our work on this issue, and we think that there's a lot that we can learn from the past days to carry forward. First of all, we think it's very important for us to preserve the overall spirit of the conversation, where we felt that there was a commonality of purpose to address with urgency the very real needs and concerns of the most vulnerable, but also to acknowledge that there remain differences of views how best and most effectively to address those needs and concerns. We also think it's very important for us to learn from the approach and to preserve the basic approach that we've taken in the dialogue so far, which was to be, as others have said, inclusive, expert-driven, informed by real experience, listening to concrete proposals that can take us forward, being open to specific critiques and challenges in a way that will generate tangible outcomes from our work. And then finally, we think it's very important to capture the content of our conversations as well, but in a way that focuses on areas of convergence rather than establishing some kind of set of binary choices. And for us, we do think that there was a lot in terms of what we shared and what we learned from others that showed convergence in the sense that there are agencies and actors within the existing system that undoubtedly have helped many people in need prepare for and to recover from extreme events. However, it's also clear that the existing system is not well coordinated. In some circumstances, its mandates with regard to loss and damage aren't clear. There are significant barriers to access. There are gaps in its coverage. Many have mentioned slow onset events and non-economic losses as examples of that. And the resources in that system are insufficient. Even those agencies that were describing how it is that they were acting in the area of loss and damage clearly indicated that the resources are insufficient. So for now, as we said at the outset of this dialogue, we see these dialogues not as simply ending a process, but the start of a process that does not stop with a landscaping exercise, but must move towards action, building on what we've learned. We think, therefore, the next stage of our process should really focus, as others have said, on the how. How existing resources can be strengthened, including by looking at what we didn't get a chance to look at so carefully this time, the action that is taken through bilateral assistance. Some have mentioned the importance of South-South cooperation, but really working on how that current existence can be strengthened. Secondly, we have to look at how gaps can be identified and filled. It's very important, we think, to take a hard look at the question of why as well. Why is this current system falling short? Why are there, for example, delays in access? Why are there barriers to access? Why do the conventional sources of funding for the existing system consistently fall short of what is needed? We need to answer these hard questions with regard to why, so as to ensure that any additional steps that we take improve upon and not replicate the sources of frustration that we've heard so clearly in the room, even just now in the most recent set of interventions. So for us, we continue to engage with an open mind as to where this dialogue leads us, but again need to be guided by the overall objective of ensuring that the outcomes that we agree serve the needs of the most vulnerable. And we think that the start that we made during this week is leading us in the right direction to finding the very hard answers to those incredibly important questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, European Union. Vanuatu.
Thank you, co-facilitators, colleagues.
Here we are again at the end of another dialogue on finance for loss and damage, where we have shared our experiences and given concrete solutions. And we request again that these discussions are fully captured, formally documented, and published. But there's one takeaway that Vanuatu gains from this process, and that is the gap, the urgent and life-taking gap in finance to address loss and damage. I will give some suggestions for further discussions as request. Our colleagues from the islands have been devastatingly clear that right now, today, the vast majority of existing funding arrangements do not provide finance to address loss and damage, particularly slow onset events and the myriad of impacts that result in non-economic losses and damages. That should be a subject of further discussions. Thanks to my colleagues as well from the G77 and China and AOSIS, that the dialogue can only be called successful if it results in a real outcome that delivers loss and damage finance for people in the islands and around the world. Right now, the land of our island villages is being lost by insidious sea level rise. And right now, increasing ocean acidification is taking away forever our life-giving coral reefs. The restart responses, which we heard about today, have been underway repeatedly for years in the Pacific. This should be discussed in future dialogues. We've heard over the last days that there is a complex network of funding arrangements, humanitarian, early warning systems, insurance, and funds that avert and minimize impacts. But who is really paying for addressing those impacts? It is overwhelmingly our developing country governments, it is our island villages, it is our families. That must be discussed at future dialogues. It's clear that we've lost the trust of many already, and Vanuatu acknowledges the inputs by the NGOs and our women and gender constituency for speaking real-world truth in this political process. They must continue to be involved in future dialogues. And thanks also to the parties and the organizations who've highlighted the work that they're already doing, even announcing new initiatives right here today that will expand loss and damage finance and scale and delivery, and we look forward to the materialization of that finance in the Pacific Islands, but we ask that that be anchored under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. That must be a subject of future dialogues. Moving forward, I would beg us all to go back to our capitals and work to achieve a mandate to come to COP27 and CMA4 to agree to a loss and damage finance facility. This finance facility is called for by more than 2/3 of the parties in this room, and I don't think it's at the end of a spectrum, as we've heard said. Rather, Vanuatu sees a finance facility as being inclusive, which can be crafted as a way to capture some of the existing mechanisms, as well as incentivizing new and upscaled finance to address loss and damage. There are signals coming from parties in this room across the political spectrum, and we think that we've got the solutions. We've just been too polarized and afraid to talk about reality and put them into COP and CMA text. And we've also been too afraid to acknowledge that the necessary finance for loss and damage is actually flowing around the world today. It's just going into militaries and to new fossil fuel projects. That should be addressed at future dialogues. The establishment of a loss and damage finance facility this year will be an essential political signal, giving the world, our people, our youth, an indication that they can actually trust us, and that we can bring some dignity and some protection of the fundamental human rights, some hope to us, the most vulnerable, that we will not continue to be left alone as we face this nightmare of climate change, and that insufficient action here over the last 30 years has brought to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanuatu. The Marshall Islands.
Thank you, co-facilitators, excellencies, colleagues. I begin by supporting the statement made by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of AOSIS and Pakistan on behalf of the G77 and China. The view of the Pacific small island developing states is that this dialogue will only produce results if there is a pathway for it to do so. A dialogue without deliverables, outcomes, and timelines reported is the definition of a talk shop. AOSIS and the PCIDs have been engaging constructively in conversations about loss and damage as we have heard, for more than 3 decades. It is now time to establish a facility. We have repeatedly raised the inadequacies of existing mechanisms, and AOSIS has put forward a comprehensive review of the gaps. Many of my Pacific colleagues have spent time in the dialogue sessions, and we've heard today from my brothers from Palau, from Vanuatu just now, detailing the gaps in existing climate finance for loss and damage. There are significant gaps in climate finance around resettlement issues, and we've heard this particularly from Fiji. There is little to no available climate finance for slow onset events, such as sea level rise, and there are no current climate finance solutions for the critical issues of non-economic loss, including loss of cultural heritage and ecosystems. We've heard that there's consensus in the dialogue about these gaps. The finance options we have today are not designed to cover all aspects of loss and damage. They are insufficiently funded even for the work that they are designed to do, and they are slow and inaccessible in responding to those of us that are being hit fastest and hardest with loss and damage today. We have heard in the dialogues about existing mechanisms, and we acknowledge that there is some small-scale funding for loss and damage. To be clear, humanitarian funding is important and deserving of resources, but is also only a small piece of what is needed for loss and damage. Disaster risk reduction is also critical. Again, however, it is also only a part of the picture and also under-resourced. Insurance schemes, where they exist, are one of many needed interventions, but are not the answer to a highly complex set of issues faced by SIDS. And for us, there would be major concerns around sustainability of such schemes, including premiums. AOSIS has put forward concrete procedural and technical proposals for how to make the Glasgow dialogue more effective. These proposals would make the process more party-driven and productive and require a synthesis report to capture outcomes from the dialogue. We also recommended guiding questions that would help us to address the finance gaps that have already been identified and drive the process toward concrete outcomes and implementation. For example, how do we map existing finance products as well as the gaps around available climate finance for addressing loss and damage from slow onset loss? How do we map existing finance products? This requires innovative thinking, and it requires all of us as parties working together. I do also want to respond to the point on how important mitigation is, on which, of course, we fully agree. Small island developing states have been at the forefront of the fight for 1.5, and we will remain in that fight. The requirement to address loss and damage is one that comes with the impacts that we experience today, even within that vital threshold, and it's terrifying to think beyond that threshold. In Glasgow, we agreed to the dialogue on the basis that it would lead to a finance facility at COP27. Colleagues, we can only congratulate ourselves on this dialogue being constructive if it builds towards an outcome that delivers loss and damage finance results for people in the Pacific and across the globe. Unless there is a route to reach a collective decision on adequate, new, and additional accessible financing for loss and damage, it will not. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanuatu. I have many speakers still on the list and less than 15 minutes left because I would like to give the floor to the SBI chair. So I would just make a plea to you that if to not necessarily repeat what some of the feedback has already been said, and if you have something additional to add, to focus on that. Salim, you have the floor next.
Thank you very much, co-facilitator. I'm Salim ul Haq from the International Center for Climate Change and Development. I'd like to thank the organizers for 2 very successful days of sharing. In the spirit of not repeating things as we go forward, I'd like to make 2 suggestions. Firstly, the combination of avert, minimize, and address loss and damage is really not helpful anymore. And I would like to suggest that in future dialogues we have exclusively addressing and financing addressing of loss and damage as an issue that needs to be addressed in its own right and not confusing it with averting and minimizing. The second discrepancy that we need to also think about is that the overlap of the existing humanitarian sector overlaps closely with rapid onset loss and damage, cyclones, hurricanes, floods, etc., does not overlap at all with slow onset, like we heard about sea level rise. And I can tell you in my country, Bangladesh, sea level rise is making people lose their livelihoods and forcing them to migrate to the cities like Dhaka. And there's no humanitarian system that addresses that. It's not a cyclone, it's not a flood, it's just slow creeping sea level rise and salinity. And so we need to be addressing that. And that is peculiar to human-induced climate change. It's not just a natural event that we're having more of. It is human-induced climate change caused. And we need to be thinking about that. So I would hope that we can have specific, very focused discussions on these particular aspects next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Mexico.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. We acknowledge the input shared by the facilitators and the efforts made on this first part of the dialogue. So to give you some inputs really specific for Mexico and really special, we think that we must differentiate and define the climate adaptation finance, humanitarian finance, and loss and damage finance. We need to find a way to build consensus between different stakeholders to create a strategy to track the efforts already done and enhance the financial access to address also non-economic losses, events that may involve irreversible and permanent loss and damage, resilience and reconstruction of communities, livelihood, and ecosystems. We also think that we could work in a regional way to involve also local actors, authorities to the dialogue, because they are the first that need to react to climate impacts. So I will keep brief, and it's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mexico. Next, Colombia.
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. First of all, I'm speaking once again on behalf of ILAC, and we would like to align ourselves with the previous intervention made by G77. We share the frustration expressed by AOSIS, LDCs, Maldives, Tuvalu, and all developing country parties concerning the way that we have been discussing the issue of loss and damage since many years ago. We would like to propose a way forward as you request, Madam Co-Facilitator. I'm going to highlight 4 key points on behalf of ILAC. The first one, we think that it's important to have submissions for the second dialogue, a call for submissions that parties can provide specific inputs in terms of on how to organize this second dialogue, as well as to invite other stakeholders in this process. Second, we think that it's important to have a report, as was mentioned by many other parties, from the SBI chair of the first dialogue. Third, on the dialogue per se, we believe that one dialogue per year is not enough to make progress at the speed required on achieving a common understanding of the present and future loss and damage in terms of the financial gaps and needs, and on the financial arrangements that will best address the gaps and needs. It will thus be important for the SBI chair and or the UK co-presidency and Egyptian incoming presidency to open new spaces for parties and other stakeholders to continue their discussions, including by organizing intersessional consultations. And finally, Madam Co-Facilitator, on behalf of ILAC, we would like to support the previous intervention made by Ghana on behalf of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, particularly the idea the idea to have a mandate or to mandate the IPCC to develop a special report on loss and damage that could inform our future discussion. We believe that science is important and the IPCC can support us in this important process. Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator.
Thank you, Colombia. Jamaica.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator. I would like to start by aligning with the statement made by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of AOSIS, as well as Pakistan on behalf of G77 and China. We have had very rich exchanges, and for that we are very grateful because it also allowed us to share our country experiences. For Jamaica, we are known as, among other things, the island where we have sun, sea, and sand. If I may use as a proxy for loss and damage that's now unfolding, we are in an hourglass, and the sands of our beaches are ticking because they are running out. We see it in the houses that are lost on the coast of St. Margaret's Bay, or the beaches of Hellshire, one of our culturally significant places that are also lost. And we also see it in the loss of our famous 7 Mile beach in Negril. We are trying to do what we can. We're using some of our own resources, and we have also benefited from resources from partners. For example, we have a catastrophe bond that is now in place. We have insurance coverage for hurricane and excess rainfall through a parametric facility in the CRIF SPC. And we also are using a systemic risk assessment tool, or will use, that was recently launched with some partners. The intent of which is to integrate climate change in investments. But what has been clear for us and for many other developing countries is the fact that our own resources, particularly for us as a developing island nation, are grossly insufficient and continuously being threatened by exogenous shocks. The external resources and financial mechanisms, we all agree in this room, is also not enough, and in particular when it comes to slow onset events and non-economic losses. We support the call for the Glasgow Dialogue, therefore, to be meaningful in how we can fix and fill the gaps that we have identified, including the need for dedicated loss and damage financing, which can be through the loss and damage facility that we have called for as AOSIS and other developing countries. With this, maybe we can slow, to some degree, the proverbial sands that are running out of the ticking hourglass. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamaica. We have 5 minutes left. May I request the next 7 speakers to be as brief as you can and focus on your input on the next dialogue. Thank you. India.
Thank you, Co-Chair. At this stage, I'll be very brief and try to help the process further. I align my statement to the statement made by G77 in China and also by AOSIS. And it is very important from the last speaker, Jamaican colleague, speaking about erosion. So that's very important to capture, because erosion is not only about erosion of seashore or rivers. Erosion is also eroding the little 3%, 4% GDP developmental gains. So it erodes the developmental gains more than the soil and the river. So having said that, I think Glasgow Dialogue, there are 3 suggestions from the dialogue. One is that this should be captured as a formal report and should feed into the formal UNFCCC processes. Second, we also request, as requested by G77 in China, for a separate agenda item in COP27, SB57, looking at loss and damage. We also support, we all realize, I will not repeat, that the existing international finance facilities are insufficient, extremely complicated. Access is difficult, they're also insufficient, and they're not made for scenarios like loss and damage. So we do think that loss and damage finance facility is an option which is urgent option. Loans, insurance, bilateral funding, catastrophe bonds, humanitarian aid we have talked about, but that doesn't undermine the cause of the setting up of a loss damage finance facility. Now, for the upcoming second dialogue, I would reiterate a suggestion made by Colombia that we should allow submission by parties it could be more structured. I was looking at there could be 4 or 5 breakaway groups, and one could look at the financial mechanisms available right now, and that could be very important to capture. Second could be, although it's a drop in the ocean, as the early co-facilitator told, then second could be on technology for early warning, disaster and response that is available in the world by the best international experts. The third could be on thematic disasters and looking at how to do recovery and rehabilitation and also build up resilience for those structures. The fifth could be very important on how do we look at civil society bodies, organizations to look at disaster response. So these are my initial suggestions. We could take submission from the parties and then design the second dialogue to have more structured. I also thank at this stage my colleague and friend from Australia for bringing up the CDRI. We have launched at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019. We did launch a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure, which has already 31 member countries, UN agencies, multilateral developmental banks, and we're trying to look at how do you make infrastructure more resilient. And at the COP26 in Glasgow, there was a launch of a infrastructure for resilient island states movement, and that's called IRIS to help states in technology and finance both. So I'll stop at this stage after giving those suggestions. Thank you for the opportunity, ma'am.
Thank you, India. Sudan.
Thank you, co-facilitator. I will be brief. I would like at the beginning to support the statement made by Pakistan on behalf of G77 and China, and would like to reiterate that it is clear that there is funding gap, particularly when it comes to the issue of addressing loss and damage finance. And for the next step, I would like to see the discussion taking care about the distinct finance for addressing loss and damage. And we would like to see us engage in the discussion around the establishment of the finance mechanism for addressing loss and damage in order for that newly established body to identify and address all the gaps. We would like to see how we are going to scale up finance for addressing loss and damage in order to guarantee, we would love to see us guaranteeing new additional and scale up finance for loss and damage. The issue of urgency and fast access, we want it to be addressed, however, as part of the new financing arrangement or newly established body. How to close the gap of funding and approaches, because for us, we have limitation in approaches for addressing economic and non-economic losses. It's also always insurance coming up. So we want to see how regional differences could be addressed in the issue of approaches to address loss and damage in different developing countries. We echo with colleague on the issue of the need for report to capture the rich dialogue discussion that we had here in Bonn. And we echo with G77 and other colleagues on the need for a separate agenda for Glasgow dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudan. Chile?
Thank you, co-facilitator. I am speaking on behalf of Chile, and I would like to thank the facilitators, colleges, parties, and observers that have committed to this dialogue so enthusiastically during these past days. I would like to support ILAC's intervention and stress that we would like to see the fruitful results of this dialogue to be reflected in a formal setting to inform future discussions on this matter. In addition, for future dialogues, it will be of benefit to secure the effective participation of stakeholders at the subnational and local levels, indigenous peoples, and local communities. In this sense, we support the comments made by Mexico. Actual and effective action to address loss and damage should no longer be delayed. People and communities around the world have been waiting for us to effectively deliver what is really needed on the ground and show coherence between word and action. We look forward to engage in future discussions for a substantive outcome on loss and damage finance here in Bonn and at COP27. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chile. South Africa?
Thank you, Madam Co-Facilitator. This dialogue has set the scene. It painted a picture, and in terms of loss and damage, it's a grim picture. We've heard, and we fully agree, that this conversation, dialogue, should have happened decades ago. Moving forward, we no longer need to set the scene. We've done it here and now. We no longer need more examples of finance projects. We've heard them here now. We appreciate this information, and we trust these would be fully documented and captured, and that we can work from where we are today. We request that we start future dialogues and discussions with the agreements that we've reached here today. Two of them that I would like to highlight. We now agree that losses and damages are already suffered. We now agree that finance for addressing loss and damage must be made available. So for this reason, we request that future dialogues makes provision for specific and focused discussions on arrangements and functions of loss and damage finance for addressing loss and damages suffered in developed countries. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa. Canada.
Thank you. Canada would like to thank the participants to the Glasgow Dialogue and assure them that we have heard the experiences shared, the good practices, as well as the significant challenges that many continue to face way beyond their capacities and resources to adapt or respond to loss and damage. And we have also heard about the challenges faced by many in terms of accessing finance or accessing finance at the level that they require. We would like to, or we agree with the sentiment that was expressed by the EU that the outcome that we agree in this process must serve the needs of the most vulnerable. And we hope to continue to use the space of the dialogue to unpack the issues that have been noted with the existing multilateral architectures, ongoing gaps, with a clear view that these discussions will guide us in taking concrete and informed decisions that will actually help solve the issues that parties are facing. So building on what came out of this session, we support focusing future dialogues on non-economic losses, slow onset events, and longer-term finance to support recovery and rebuilding following humanitarian assistance in response to catastrophic events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Canada. I have two speakers left, Engo and Argentina. Engo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, co-facilitators, for the opportunity. I'm Harjeet Singh from Climate Action Network. Loss and damage we face today is our report card of the last 30 years of climate inaction. At the Glasgow Dialogue, the gaps have been recognized across developed and developing country parties. But we hear that some developed country parties are only interested in talking about it next year. That's not acceptable. It does not speak to the urgency and reality of people who are facing climate emergency now. When people lose homes, lands, and crops, we need to respond now and create a system that caters to the scale of the crisis. As civil society, we play a role of a watchdog and also engage in constructive proposals. As shared earlier, we have done some thinking on the principles, functions, and structure of the loss and damage finance facility and would like to engage with all the parties further. It's time to talk about how. We must establish the facility at COP27, and there's a precedence. We have done the same thing with Green Climate Fund. We have a lot more details than we had then for Green Climate Fund. And the next Glasgow dialogue can then focus on further defining governing arrangements, delivery structure, and process for needs-based resource mobilization. 90% of disasters are weather-related, and climate change is making them worse. While others can support this system, UNFCCC is responsible and accountable to people on the front line of the climate crisis. What we don't do here and at COP27 matters. What we do here and at COP27 matters. It matters to the people. It's about the message of hope that we need to send to people around the world. It's also about saving the multilateral system of global cooperation and solidarity, which I must say is at stake. It's about human rights. It's about climate justice. These words are in the Paris Agreement. It's time to implement the spirit of these letters through our action and not empty words. Thank you.
Thank you. Argentina, you are last on the list.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Facilitator. Thank you for giving us the floor at the last moment. I will be very brief. I will be speaking on behalf of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Firstly, we fully align ourselves with the statement made by Pakistan on behalf of the G77 and China. We need to move forward to address the losses and damages that developing countries are facing today and that are going to get worse in the next decades, particularly if we don't manage to keep temperature rise to levels that won't affect ecosystems in an irreversible manner, taking into consideration historic emissions and the messages arising from the latest IPCC reports on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. ABU is convinced of the need to establish a finance facility dedicated to loss and damage in order to advance proper urgent responses. We facilitate access to address extreme climate events and slow onset events in the light of the arrangement under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. This facility will channel climate finance, which must not be confused with other sources of assistance outside the Convention and its financial mechanisms. Regarding next steps for future dialogues, we believe that a more structured framework of discussion is needed, and calls for submission from parties and relevant stakeholders could help us to better organize these future dialogues. Also, we would like to break down specific thematic areas, such as non-economic losses, inclusive loss of biodiversity, slow onset events, and forced displacement as a consequence of the impacts of climate change, among others. Finally, we would like to have a clear outcome from this first Glasgow dialogue that will guide our future discussions on this crucial issue. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Argentina. With that, we are concluding this first Glasgow dialogue, and I just want to thank you on behalf of Joe and myself for the active and thoughtful and constructive engagement across the 3 days of this dialogue. I think and repeating what many have said in terms of the usefulness of this dialogue and the importance of moving forward and demonstrating action. So with that, Marianne, please.
Thank you very much, Christina. And I realize I am between you and lunch, so I will try to be brief. I will not go into substance of what I've heard here today and what I have been referred to in the many conversations you have had over the past days. But I will do some reflections on some of the things that I've heard while I've been here on the podium today. But first, let me start by thanking you all for a very rich and successful first session of the Glasgow Dialogue on funding arrangements to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. Let me also thank the able co-facilitators, Christina and Joseph, that have led the discussions throughout these days. And also Marcela and Frude for facilitating the breakout group sessions together with Joseph and Christina. Looking back on the 3 parts of the first dialogue, it has taken us from a sea setting and overview into in-depth breakout groups, with rich exchanges and in-depth discussions where you have shared your experiences and the challenges that you face. You have all added your voices to what we already know around the urgency for support, and we also heard new ideas that has come forward on ways to enhance support to address the needs of vulnerable countries, communities, and people. The feedback I've gotten from you is that those small group settings allowed for in-depth interaction and broad participations in the limited time we have in settings like this. And it also allowed you to go beyond statements, but actually to listen properly and learn from each other on your perspectives and experiences. I would like to thank the WIM Executive Committee for their contribution in developing the set of questions that guided the breakout group discussions in a structured manner. I think that having engaged in the 3 days of exchanges and discussions, I hope that you do share my sentiment that the first Glasgow dialogue has delivered and given ample opportunities from parties and non-party stakeholders to express views in an open and inclusive environment. Now we need to build on that momentum that you have created here. No one is interested in a repeated dialogue like this next year. I hear from all of you that you want to build upon what was done here when you meet next time. I also hear from all of you that you want this dialogue to be meaningful, comprehensive, and coherent, and that it responds to the challenges faced by vulnerable countries, communities, and people in developing countries. As you know, I am now consulting with parties on the proposed agenda item for matters relating to loss and damage. And I can, in this room, confirm that what you have said here today to me in the last 1.5 hours with regard to the guidance forward on making sure that we have a way to build the next dialogue upon the experiences from this dialogue that is shared by parties. So that we ensure that now when we come next time, we can further our deliberations, build and explore many avenues to respond scaled up, better, and more adequate with regard to the needs. Now, in closing the first Glasgow dialogue, let me just say this is not the end. Closing is a very strong word when it's translated into Norwegian, and I will not allude to that. Rather, let's see it as an opening for further engagement, for more active participation, and for openly and transparently sharing views on the way forward. Let me end by saying that the active engagement of all of you is absolutely vital for us all to move forward. Therefore, I am extremely grateful for all the guidance that was just provided, and I'm also very grateful for all of those of you who have taken part very actively in the duration of the Glasgow dialogue. And I know, even from those outside the room, there has been many, many active people in the hallways, and I know you will continue those conversations during the next few days, as long as we are gathered here in Bonn, and also in between until we meet next time. I will indeed bring forward and make sure that what you have said here is captured well and indeed reflected towards the next Glasgow dialogue taking place in 2023 at the SBI 58. And with that, I thank you all, and I wish you a good day, and of course, now I'm sure that you are very hungry as well, so have a good lunch. Thank you very much.